Hello. Can everyone hear me okay? Fantastic. Well, listen, good afternoon, or nearly good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along to today's special event. And thanks also to everyone who's joining us online as well. Thank you, wherever you may be watching this. My name's Christian Henderson. I'm Professor of International Law in the University of Sussex. I'm also joined alongside me here with Professor Jeremy Alouche, who works in the Institute of Development Studies here also at Sussex, but not part of the university, formally speaking. And we're really honoured to have, also sitting alongside us, Antonia Mulvey. Now, Antonia is a British lawyer and also founder and executive director of an organisation, an independent organisation, Legal Action Worldwide, which I'm sure some of you will be familiar with already. And this is an important organisation for many reasons, in particular because our topic today is about justice and how we can obtain justice for victims, for survivors of international crimes, of international human rights abuses, and perhaps possible ways forward to try and obtain that kind of justice. We see quite often the horrors that take place across the world, and we hear quite a lot about the perpetrators of those crimes, and in some cases, prosecutions of perpetrators of those crimes. And we also hear about some of the stories of the victims and survivors of those crimes. But it is that justice for those victims and survivors which I think is something which we don't necessarily hear enough about, and I think that's where Legal Action Worldwide very much plays a very, very important role. Also, and perhaps above all of that, Antonia is also an alumnus of the University of Sussex, so we can delve into a little bit into what brought her here and what perhaps inspired her to go on to do what she's done and have the career that she's had. So without further ado, if you just join me please in welcoming Antonia along with us this evening. So welcome, Antonia. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. And I think I'd just like to start really by asking you a little bit about really what brought you to Sussex, and perhaps if there was anything during your time here which perhaps may have led you into the path that you've taken and to establishing Legal Action Worldwide.
Oh, thank you so much, and good afternoon, good evening, everybody here in person and online. It is a huge pleasure to be back here. I was trying to recall when the last time was. Now I'm showing my age, but I think it might have been nearly 30 years ago. So it has changed a little bit. And I like your question, why did I come to Sussex in particular? And at that time, and it may be true now, it was I felt free thinking that was going on at the university. It was looking at activism, it was looking at human rights, it was left wing, and I wanted to be part of that and part of that free thinking and looking at how could I help individuals across the world. And I'd started thinking about that actually when I was in my teenage years, and coming to Sussex was a fundamental part of that journey that I went into, and my period that I was here for nearly 4 years, back in the 90s, those heydays actually of Brighton, I think, and Sussex University. But it was really a landmark. And I also remember that I had a professor here at the time who told me, you can do anything you want to do. And that was such an important advice that I got, as a young student, to realise that if you make a decision, if you follow through, determination, perseverance, and you gain support, then you can, follow that path that you have, and also individuals can make a difference.
Wonderful, thanks very much. And what is it you studied when you were here?
Okay, now I also have to confess it was not law, so sorry for that. Exactly. I studied history here. I studied Indian and Chinese history at that time for 4 years. Actually, there was only 4 people in our class. So I guess that was quite a privilege at that time to have such a small class. Only thing was it did mean we didn't have lectures because there weren't enough people. But because of that, we were able to delve into different aspects of history. And I found that, looking at that, of course, the past, we have to look to the future. And many of the work that we do now is dealing with the past. And of course, justice and accountability is an absolute crucial element of that. We can't people don't forget what has happened to them. It shapes politics, it shapes justice, it shapes the legal landscape. So studying history was my first step to what I went on to do. And then here, anybody who's studying history, apologies, but I then also thought, well, what can I do with my history degree? And I have to say, it wasn't obvious to me at that time. I wasn't going to become a professor of history. And so, that's a good question. I don't have the answer to that quite now, but I think that, I guess what I was thinking, I wanted to try to take action as I saw it. And at that time, I decided that the law was going to be the avenue for me personally. And as I was looking around here at Sussex as well, there was a lot of activism going on and looking at conflicts around the world and what could we do to help. And I think now you have so much access, you can see playing out in real time, right? Conflicts through the social media. We're so aware of what is happening. But actually at that time it was even much more difficult. And I was just recounting that when I came here, there was just starting email. So, that was the situation, and that was the path that I then chose, and then went on to study law, but history was the key element.
I guess I want to intervene here because I just feel humanitarian activism, I feel is so central, and I just wanted your viewpoint about the evolution of it, and, talking about the heydays in the 90s and so on, and what is humanitarian activism nowadays compared to how it was, and do you feel the sort of critical breaks and junctures around the way it has evolved, and especially in some ways the humanitarian sector as a whole, which was really coming from the sort of activist background and then got transformed into something much more sort of professionalized, and some say perhaps lost a bit of its soul. So I wanted to know what you thought about that.
I started my international work 20 years ago in Sudan, in Darfur, during the war then. And I started working for the International Rescue Committee, a humanitarian organisation, and then joined the United Nations. And I think at that time, as you say, there was a feeling that, humanitarian organisations were getting... is it that the needs are greater now? Is it that there's less funding? It's difficult to say. But I remember at that time, you felt that you were given the resources in order to serve the populations that we were trying to assist. And I think now we see a real struggle as we see more and more conflicts, more and more people in need. There is less funding available. And also if we look, I think, internally at countries, and it mainly is Western countries, if we can put it like that, Europe, the US, who are funding humanitarian organisations, we are seeing challenges and difficulties. If you speak to people who are working for the UN at that time, they would almost say that they were like the kingpins, the queen pins, weren't they? They were able to they were interim governments in some senses, and I think that rightly has also changed. It had to change, and where will humanitarian organisations go next? It's difficult. We also look at attacks against aid workers right now, and this is, I think, is a real challenge that we see in today's world.
Yeah, when we talk about conflicts, you mentioned Darfur there, and some of us may have seen on the news today that the prosecutor, the ICC, has asked for arrest warrants for those involved in that particular conflict. And that's quite an old conflict now. It goes back decades. And I think my question really is, have we seen conflicts changing in character? And what sort of problems does that pose for those who are trying to seek justice, do you think, if you have seen a change in the sort of character of conflicts that are taking place today?
if we look at Sudan, and you've probably seen what's happening on the news, and as you said, now there's a request for arrest warrants. But 20 years ago, when I was living in Darfur during the war, that's when the ICC investigation opened up, and people were crying out for justice and accountability. And in fact, at that time, as a humanitarian organisation, we were not able to even interact with the International Criminal Court and the investigation. 20 years on, if we look at the crimes that are taking place, the allegations against the two main leaders of the SAF and the RSF, I always question to myself, and we've had this discussion, what could have been done more at that time? Why did we not do more? What have we learned from that 20 years ago when we have failed? Have we failed to justice and accountability those victims and survivors? And what the grave sexual violence that we saw then has arguably increased. And right now we are working on Sudan, and when we speak to individuals working there on the border of Chad, and those that we're working with, they say that the sexual violence is the tool of the conflict, that they're overwhelmed in their centres by the number of women and girls that are coming forward. That's not to say that sexual violence is new in conflicts, but I just question how we can learn from that time and now to look to see to better implement as well these investigations and also arrest warrants.
Yeah, that's interesting what you say in regards to sort of sexual violence being a major part of these conflicts today. Do you feel that the organisation Legal Action Worldwide, being sort of a female-led organisation, has it been a positive aspect of it that's had that side to it, investigating and looking into these particular conflicts and with that as a particular aspect to them?
So I want to go back a moment when I started as a young lawyer in the UK in a human rights law firm, and I was representing asylum seekers. At that time, you didn't get any training. You were just told, yeah, here, deal with this caseload. And you know what happened? Because I was a woman, for any individual that came forward, particularly women or children, where they thought they may have suffered from sexual violence, the file was handed to me. You're a woman, you interview, you deal with it. So if we go back in time, I think that was how it used to be. No training, you learn on the job. As we move forward now, yes, of course, being a woman, I've been acutely aware of sexual violence taking place, but also what we know is that it's not only women and girls, it's men and boys, LGBTQI community. And in fact, in many of the conflicts that we're working in, we represent more men and boys who've suffered from sexual violence than women and girls, particularly in detention facilities, particularly in context of, for example, Myanmar and Syria. So I'm aware, yes, and then within the organisation, we haven't got an expertise. There's not one person who has training on gender or how to deal with survivors of sexual violence. Everybody's expected to have a minimum understanding, because at the end of the day, you never know who you're speaking with, who may have suffered from that, either during the current conflict or since they have left their home en route, which happens, or in the camp that they are, or before that, because of course in many of these situations, and it's not only in conflict situations, there's very high levels of domestic family violence, which we see hugely wherever we are working.
I guess I've got a question about, probably talking about this topic today, there's probably a lot of skeptical people around the room, around or perhaps not, I don't know, around international humanitarian law. Is it really an effective instrument with all the things that were happening in Gaza, or the other conflicts that are just completely invisible? So what's happening in Sudan not being covered at all, and so on. So what has sort of kept your faith in this instrument? How do you feel the organisation is using it to the sort of best as it can in some ways, to try and convince the sceptical people?
Okay. It is a good question, and I was so I have lots of answers to this. But the first one, I'm going to start with the fact that 1 week ago, just over 1 week ago, I was giving a lecture in Beirut at a university, and when you give a lecture on international justice and looking at international crimes that are taking place, it's a very tough conversation to have. And the questions that I received from the audience, in particular students, were really pointed questions and saying, first of all, the question I often get is, what are you talking about? International law is completely broken in our region, and what is the purpose of it? And also that there's a breakdown of global international justice order. And these are really good questions that they are asking, and also they talk about very personal experiences from Iraq, from Palestine, from Syria, and also from Lebanon, of course, as well, because there's been the recent war there. And my answer to them is also imagine a world where we didn't have international law, international humanitarian law, international human rights law, international criminal law, because we wouldn't be able to say that we are in breach or we are in violation of the law, and history will show that action was taken, that breaches, that violations took place, and that's absolutely crucial. It's crucial particularly also for the victims and survivors. They know that cases are being taken, and we hear that repeatedly, thank you, we're not forgotten. And that's something I think that's absolutely vital. And I want to share a story with you, if I may as well. Conversely, just before Christmas time, I was in Ukraine. I was in and listening to women, meeting with women who'd been under Russian occupation, breaches of IHL, breaches of international criminal law. And they had suffered from crimes, and all the allegations were against the Russian military. And when I sat with them, we sat for 2 to 3 hours, and I listened to them, and they said, Antonia, we are forgotten. Nobody cares about what is happening to us. And I found that absolutely extraordinary, because I had thought that of all the conflicts around the world where there is a tension, Ukraine is at the top of the list. And if you coming from, we hear these double standards, what's happening. So here to sit and listen to people say that we've been forgotten, there's massive breaches of international law, nobody cares. Then you get into a complex conversation about these issues, but also the difficulty that is faced, that when you are suffering yourself, you have suffered, your family have suffered, your community has suffered. It's extraordinarily difficult to have empathy and sympathy for others in other contexts, but that is what we need to do better.
I think that's a really good point, and I think it also, in a broader sense, raises the issue around selective justice. And I'm just wondering, from the perspective of legal action worldwide, how do you determine which situations you're going to focus on? Is it because you're approached in some ways, or is it off your own back that you think this situation is dire, this needs some intervention?
That is a great question. That's a question that we're asked all the time, actually. Why this context? Why not us? Why are you not working in Afghanistan? Why are you not working here? And it really arises in many different ways. First, as an organisation, we need to see what value would we have to add to the victims and survivors of the violations and international crimes. Are there others that are undertaking this work? So we are not needed. Secondly, are we getting repeated telephone calls and emails asking us, please come and help us, please come and help us? And we get that a lot. And requests to come and give advice and assistance. And then we look at what types of violations and crimes are taking place, because we have a lot of focus on gendered crimes and those who are most vulnerable, which is not necessarily women and children. It might be, but it really depends on the context, and that our particular skill set can help them. I think also we're a frontline organisation, so 80% of our staff are working in the conflict areas where the crimes and violations are taking place. So that's an important part for us, because can we be in the next neighbouring country, or how are we going to actually assist those victims and survivors? And then, of course, finally, but not first, is do we have the resources to really adequately assist people? And because, of course, these justice cases take some time.
Yeah, I was just going to jump. Thank you, Antonia. I was just going to jump in here because I know you've got a short video you'd like to play, and this could be a good time to play that before continuing the discussion. I should just mention before we play this, for those watching it online, it might not be the best experience for you, but hold on and we'll rejoin. But before we actually get to the video, do you just want to explain a little bit as to what it's about and give us some context?
So we just marked 10 years of our work, and a short documentary video was prepared about our work. And it's many of those we represent. You can't travel to meet them. You can't access many of the areas where our teams are. So the idea was to video the victims, the survivors, some of our staff talking about the work, so people can get a direct sense of what it's like to work on the front lines, and also what it's like to listen to some of the victims and survivors and what they have experienced. So we're going to bring them to you because we can't take everybody to them, and that was part of the idea of this short video.
Great, thanks, Antonia.
Repeatedly shared their stories with the world, the mass killings, the torture, and the severe sexual violence committed against them and their family members by the Myanmar military. Since 2018, at Legal Action Worldwide, we've been working on legal processes to ensure that the perpetrators of these mass atrocities endured by the Rohingya are held to account.
In 2019, the Rohingya survivors travelled all the way from Captain Cox's Bazaar to The Hague for hearings on provisional measures in the genocide case between Myanmar and the Gambia.
Dr. Shanti Mohila and a wider network of survivor advocates are most definitely on the front lines for the fight for justice for the Rohingya community.
Law also works directly with survivors. Operating in 6 IDP camps in Mogadishu, Law has collected more than 1,600 complaints, supported victims to report more than 400 complaints to police, and secured more than 200 convictions for gender-based violence, including instances of rape and gang rape of children.
One NGO is taking legal action against the
Legal
government.
Action Worldwide filed a complaint against the government of South Sudan on behalf of 30 women who say they were raped by members of the military.
In 2023, nearly 500 aid workers were injured, kidnapped, or killed worldwide. National staff are overwhelmingly the victims of attacks.
There seems to be an exponential increase in the killings of humanitarian aid workers, as well as the kidnapping. The problem is that the world has become a much, much more violent place. This is why working with law is so important. Who build not only rights of those who are entitled to them, but to build a foundation for a campaign.
We have documented mass killings, rape, starvation, destruction of schools and medical facilities, forced displacement, and mass arbitrary detention amounting to both war crimes and crimes against humanity.
In 2021, Tigrayan communities approached Law for help to hold Ethiopia accountable. In 2022, Law and its partners filed the first cases on their behalf against Ethiopia at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. For the first time in 10 years, the African Commission issued provisional measures against Ethiopia, calling for an end to extrajudicial killings, sexual violence, and torture, and to allow humanitarian aid into Tigray. In 2020, law filed a criminal case in Lebanon arguing slavery, slave trading, torture, racial and gender discrimination against the former employer and recruiter of MH, an Ethiopian migrant domestic worker who was enslaved for more than 7 years in Beirut. The case is ongoing and inspiring a movement across Lebanon and the Middle East to end the oppressive kafala system. Victims and survivors of gender crimes during the Lebanese civil war have rarely spoken about their experiences. UN Women and Law set about giving them a voice. Law submitted 477 pages of testimonial evidence to the United Nations Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances, seeking information on the truth and whereabouts of people who disappeared during the conflict.
طبعا مثل حكاية المرأة أنها تروح على الدوائر الحكومية أو تبحث عنه كان كتير صعب بالنسبة لي، والحمد لله رب العالمين. يعني إيش بدي أسوي؟ بتمنى يعني هيك أعرف مصيره وأعرف يعني عن أي شيء عنه.
Thank you very much. What's really interesting, I feel, on your organisation, and it's just to sort of bring a buzzword in the sort of humanitarian sector that's coming along, or has been along for quite a while now, emerge at the sort of Grand Bargain, and this idea of a sort of localization agenda. And in some ways, it seems that your organisation seems to operate on this model, but at the same time, the whole sector seems to be struggling with pushing this agenda. So, how do you feel about the sort of difficulty of putting forward the sort of localization agenda, and what are your thoughts about localization in general, if I may?
Yes. I mean, as I mentioned, the model that we have taken is that how can you be working in these conflict areas if you're not present yourself? So that's number one, which is why we have staff and partners working in very, very challenging and difficult circumstances, including, as you saw, in Mogadishu, been in Syria, partners throughout the war, and many other different contexts. And I think it's vital if you're going to get trust and confidence within the community that we are present. And as you saw there, we have teams who are in Cox's Bazar day in, day out, working in the refugee camps, which is why we're also representing more than 500 Rohingya in their quest for international justice and accountability. I think that, and we have national lawyers working with us. They are the ones who need to be filing the cases. It can't just be a British lawyer like me who's going to pitch up. It doesn't work. It's not sustainable, and it's not viable. If we look at what's happening in Syria right now, and I was just in Damascus last week, and I hope I can talk a bit about that. You see the Syrian organisations returning and registering and demanding that it should be Syrian-led and locally led, even though, of course, they're asking for assistance with capacity and these different aspects. But it's absolutely integral, and it can't be that we just say that. It has to be actually, we need to support that. And I think it's still struggling. So we, whilst working in the humanitarian sector, would classify ourselves as a legal human rights organisation working in complex humanitarian situations. And we also represent many humanitarian organisations and aid workers who've come under attack. And let's not forget that humanitarian organisations in these complex areas are having national staff who are mainly working in conflict areas, and it's national staff who have the highest numbers of individuals who are killed, tortured and detained. And we have to really reflect on that, and where there's a passing on as well of responsibility. Where is the duty of care to these national staff? So I could see you want to ask something, Christian.
Yeah, well, I was just wondering, going back to the film we just watched. Then there was some reference made to the case against Myanmar at the International Court of Justice. So there was a level of state accountability there against Myanmar as a state. And we hear about cases being brought at the International Criminal Court, so individual criminal accountability or responsibility for certain international crimes. But a lot of what you're talking about, Antonia, is at a ground level. It's within countries. Do you think if we're looking at justice, we need to be looking more at justice within states, taken by perhaps domestic legal systems, truth and reconciliation commissions, those sorts of aspects? Are they a more important form of justice than these sort of international level forms that we see more often than not in the news?
I think we have to start in the country. Primarily, we should be starting in the country where the violation and or the crime has taken place. That is our starting point. But we know that that is not always possible. In the situation of Myanmar, that is not possible. It wasn't possible in Syria. It wasn't possible in Sudan for some time, but let's see, things change, and they can change dramatically overnight. So we need to be preparing organisations and individuals that we hope for that moment that we will be able to take cases through the national courts. But as you've said, Christian, not everybody wants a legal case. Think about it yourselves. You know, you might want legal information, but you're not going to take a case through the courts. Actually, what we hear from many is individuals, especially if crimes have taken place a long time ago, or they think that there's almost no possibility for justice through the courts, is they want truth. I want to know the truth. We see that particularly with those who've had family members who have disappeared. I want to know the truth of what has happened to them, and they want acknowledgement, and they want apology. And the next that we hear as well is that they want reparations in the form of compensation. So retributive justice can be sometimes one of the last aspects, of which I mean criminal investigation and prosecution. But that would be the starting point in the country itself. And just to tell you something, that I was just in South Sudan, and you saw a few months ago, if you were watching that video, you'll have seen that we filed a case against the government of South Sudan. When we filed the case against the government of South Sudan, shortly afterwards, it was in a UN mechanism, they said that I had personally disrupted the peace process. So for some time, it did not go back to the country, because at that time, those that we're representing, which were 30 women and girls, had fled the country, and we could not see how we could get justice within the country at that time. A few months ago, I went back to South Sudan, to Juba. We represent 3 girls who were subjected to rape and gang rape, all the allegations, again, also against the South Sudan military, and I filed in person the first ever war crimes case file to the South Sudanese investigators and prosecutors, who stamped the file and said we're ready for the first time to open up an investigation into war crimes during the conflict. So here already we're seeing a change 5 years on, that we have to be pushing cases through the national courts and systems. So, but I think, you know, it's not an either or. We can have all going on at the same time, and the Ukraine, of course, is an example of that. We have cases going through the national courts, the International Criminal Court, and the International Court of Justice, and other cases ongoing as well at the same time, because, of course, so many crimes are taking place. It's quite difficult to address, and that's let alone other aspects of register of damages and so on.
Yeah, and I can imagine as well at a state level, state authorities, they can be probably quite resistant to even allowing international crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity being something which could be prosecuted at a national level, because that a source of embarrassment to them. It could be, you know, something which they just don't really want to acknowledge. So is that something which you've really had to sort of press up against and push back against?
Yes, quite a lot. We had, let's look at an example from Lebanon where we brought, just looking at a report. So we brought out a report looking at gendered crimes during the Lebanese Civil War, 1975 to 1990, where we unpacked for the first time the scale of sexual violence that took place, which would constitute a war crime and potentially crime against humanity. There's a 1991 amnesty law, which meant justice avenues within Lebanon were very difficult. But bringing out that report, here I'm going to say something slightly different, I'm going to go back to your sort of question. When we brought out that report within Lebanon, you would have thought it would be the Lebanese government that would be pushing out against us to say that war crimes took place. Actually, we got threats from different governments and threats to myself and to the organisation not to publish the report because of who the allegations were against different military from different countries around the world. So here we have different situations which you would have thought, I've thought it was going to be the Lebanese authorities saying there's no way you're going to do this, but no, it really changes in different circumstances. When I was last week in Damascus meeting with the interim government there, here it's like we will focus on the war crimes against humanity that took place by the regime, by the Assad regime, and they are all for investigation and prosecution of those crimes, but only related to the regime. They did not any talk about any crimes by any other parties.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
I guess I've got a question which is about, to what extent sort of work on justice have a more transformative effect on society in some ways. So the idea that going to court, searching the truth, getting this has a bigger transformative effect on society relations, gender relations, and so on. So it'd be interesting to hear from your experience about that.
Yeah, thanks. I would like to give you two examples, and one of them is related to Rohingya women who fled Myanmar into Bangladesh. You probably remember that in 2017 we saw nearly 800,000 Rohingya women fleeing into Bangladesh. It's a very patriarchal society, and in fact when I was interviewing, and I was a UN investigator at the time, when you would meet with women and girls, you'd have to meet in a shelter that's barely bigger than this, and they were not allowed to leave. Can't leave, have no life outside of the family life, so to speak. Even leave that shelter area. Now we started working with them because many of them had their children killed, their husbands killed, many of them were widows, and assisted them in their quest for justice and accountability. They gave evidence in the first ever criminal case in Argentina on the crime of genocide, and it was 6 women and 1 man that we took to Argentina. It took 1 year to get them there. When they returned from giving evidence to the Argentinian prosecutor, the women said to me, who would have ever thought it would be the Rohingya women that would hold the Myanmar military to account? And it had reversed the patriarchal norms through the avenue of justice. In fact, we actually had men coming to our centre in Cox's Bazar saying, we'd like our wives, we'd like our sisters to join this, because it was seen for the community a bigger issue than themselves is international justice. And that's when we also see many people coming forward, particularly men will come forward to talk about sexual violence they've suffered when it's something that's bigger than themselves, which is basically international justice for their community. So we see it in different ways. What we call it is victim to survivor to advocate. When we see people, they are broken, they're completely broken. They're not survivors, many of them. They wouldn't describe themselves in that way. But through this journey and asking what kind of justice do you want, they move to be survivors and then also to advocate themselves for what they want, which of course is the best. Better than me speaking for them, let them speak for themselves, which is not always so easy, but we try to make it happen.
Okay. I guess I'll move on now to a much bigger question, because we haven't talked very much about sort of the political economy of the sector. So, and I'm bringing this up because there's a lot of talk of the sort of humanitarian sector being in crisis in some ways, in many ways. And I guess the question is how. It's a big question. Be careful. Get ready. It is about rethinking the system. How can we rethink the sort of humanitarian system? Because there's always this sort of vicious circle of more and more crisis, more and more funding, and you just feel that it's not getting anywhere, and there's more and more problems in some ways of what we could call the humanitarian sector becoming a sector of managing sort of protracted crisis, which is basically, we've been talking about Darfur, we've been talking about, I don't know if we mentioned DRC, but we've been talking about Gaza. These places have been in conflict for some 30, 40 years, and in some ways it's coming in, fixing the emergency, going away, but the sort of conflict comes back and back again. So in some ways, are there ways that we can try and rethink, if you like, the whole sort of humanitarian system as a whole? Because it seems that it's reaching a potential limit there, or not, is the question.
That is a big question, and I mean, as I mentioned before, I am a humanitarian in one sense, but I'm not working or representing a humanitarian organisation, but we're working in humanitarian spaces, and as you said, what I can't fathom in my head is what's going to be happening as we see an increase of needs, an increase of conflicts, and a decrease of funding without seeing how this situation is going to improve as countries may be moving to far right, and we're going to see even further restrictions on funding available, and also as countries are, and goes with it, the politics are looking inwards more. What should we be doing for our own population and not looking outwards? And so it's hard to fathom what will be happening. I mean, from our perspective, what we do look at increasingly is looking at justice and accountability for attacks against humanitarian organisations and the total impunity that is taking place for attacks. Because if we see what's happening, targeting of aid workers, targeting of humanitarian organisations and particularly healthcare facilities is on the rise. That's what the statistics show. At the same time, what the statistics show is that there's almost total impunity for these attacks. And what does that say? Impunity breeds further violence. Fact. It's not just because I think it, because I'm a lawyer. It's shown to be true. If we don't start to hold these individuals or states accountable for the actions that have taken place, we're going to see an increase in this vicious circle. And there's a targeting of aid workers, and also because once you reduce the number of aid workers, it also allows an increase in the attacks on the civilian population. That's a direct correspondence to that. So an area that we've been looking at is that we must overcome this problem we have here, where humanitarian organisations and aid workers do not want to report attacks that have taken place to them or their facilities. And then they're going to report. And do you know what it reminded me of? When I first started working representing individuals who suffer from domestic violence in the UK, because before I went internationally, I practiced in the UK, and that's a really vital part. If you do want to go and practice international law abroad and be advising others, you'd rather have practiced in your own country to have something to hang it upon. This element to go back and say that domestic violence survivors would not report what had happened to them. That's what happened 25 years ago. They didn't report it, and also you see that again with survivors of sexual violence in conflict. They won't report what has happened to them. And the same reasons you see aid workers and organisations are not reporting what has happened to them. And that, if you think about it, cannot be right, that the two have the same reasons. Fear of retaliation, stigma, we hear as well. They don't know where to report. They don't know who to report to. They think that legal cases will be too risky, too expensive, too challenging, and who will undertake this. So what we have been working on is filing cases on behalf of humanitarian organisations and aid workers, and we filed 2 war crimes. I'm not completely answering your question, I know that. No. But we filed 2 war crimes cases, and one is about to go public. one's killing of an aid worker and others in relation to the torture of one, to show if you commit these crimes, you can be investigated and you can be held accountable. So I think we have to start there. So that's one area of a vicious cycle in this humanitarian world that we are seeing as conflicts arise, as the attacks on aid workers and organisations arise. This is something that we have to be focusing upon. There is a massive recognition of this, and humanitarian organisations also wanting to now address this problem, and this is what we all have a role to play in that, and to ask our own governments to be taking action in this as well.
Yeah, on that point actually, Antonia, I was going to ask you about this. Quite recently, the UK Parliament has launched a committee looking into attacks on aid workers, which I know is something which you are a specialist in, and of course Legal Action Worldwide focuses a lot on. And a big part of the inquiry within the Parliament was looking at what specifically the United Kingdom might do to try and prevent impunity for attacks on aid workers. And of course the United Kingdom is not a special country, but of course it does have certain significance in that it is, for example, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. So it has a certain diplomatic clout there, which it perhaps could use in a positive way. So I guess my question for you is there something that the UK could be doing to try and prevent impunity for attacks on humanitarian aid workers, which, as you say, is very much on the rise?
Yes, I think there is. So first of all, within the UK, within the legal framework of the UK does not allow for investigations and prosecutions allowing the principles of extraterritorial and universal jurisdiction. So, for example, and I think this is a good starting point. If again the UK rightly calls for accountability for aid workers, also calls for accountability for conflict-related sexual violence, and of course the UK has been pioneering the Prevention of Sexual Violence initiative, where it repeatedly calls for justice and accountability of survivors, and the two are linked. And yet, if we look at, I said, well, one of the starting points for the UK is to look at amend your legal framework to allow us, who represents individuals who've suffered from these crimes, for these crimes to be taken through the UK courts. At the moment, they do not, and it's very, very limited. So this is something I think we should be pushing for, and the UK could undertake. And I hope with this, the current government, right, and the Attorney General, who have backgrounds in international law, I think there is definitely this possibility in that discussion. Also, we had UN Security Council Resolution 2730 that was passed last year in May, which focuses particularly on attacks against aid workers, premises and assets. And the recommendations from that were presented to the Security Council in November by the UN Secretary General has some very clear requirements and requests, which is namely that states should report on investigations and prosecutions that they have undertaken in relation to aid worker attacks. It's called humanitarian personnel, premises and assets. Now, I'm not saying I'm a huge fan, of course, just quoting UN Security Council resolutions, but here you have a framework, and as the UK is a permanent member of the UN Security Council resolution, should be really pushing for the implementation of these very practical recommendations, including one which would be an annual forum where states would come and present what action they have taken in relation to these attacks. It would be a very good starting point, because at the moment we don't even have that information, and that's one of the difficulties that is faced, that we don't know action that member states have taken in these situations.
Okay. I've got a bit of a provocative question there, I guess, which is, in some ways, there we're searching a legal response to a problem, but what is the cause of the problem there? Why do we have a rise in attack of humanitarian aid workers? And I guess humanitarian aid workers like to portray themselves, and probably are in their souls, sort of around sort of being neutral, and I'm neutral, I shouldn't be attacked, and so on. But at the same time, isn't there sort of, what we're seeing is that there's a sort of increased hypocrisy in sort of double standards between humanitarian workers on the one hand, but at the same time the same governments that are selling arms to the conflict that is happening. So there's quite a tension that is sort of developing there. So isn't there a bigger problem there around the bigger concept of neutrality in the humanitarian sector too? in relation to this question, perhaps?
I'm not sure if any humanitarian organisation is neutral. I know they won't like me to say that, but if you look at where they're operating, it's hard to say that some of them are neutral. They're impartial.
Yeah.
They may be impartial, but are they neutral? Often because they are providing assistance to one part of the population or one area. So I think that is a discussion that we should be a little bit more open to. It's not an attack. It's let's get to grips with this. Let's be a little bit more honest about this. And that's fine to be impartial. So that's a discussion I think we need to have more. I think at the same time, as we were talking about earlier, you have a large amount of national aid workers. They're the ones who are also being frequently detained. And what are the allegations against aid workers? Two main things: espionage and terrorism. These are the allegations. Provide the facts. Provide the evidence. Provide the evidence. That may or may not be the situation, but these are always the two primary allegations. But they must be. Where is the evidence for the detention of individuals? So I think, as you say, why is there an increase? I think there's multiple reasons, but one of them is that impunity breeds further violence. Mm-hmm. You look around and you won't be held accountable. So that is one part of that very large piece, and they see that states won't take action, or it's very difficult to take action within these legal frameworks. So it's multifaceted. But I think there is certainly a change. We've seen a change in the last 15 months on this aspect.
Yeah, I think looking at accountability, particularly in conflict situations, and perhaps particularly when we're talking about attacks on aid workers as well, a lot of it comes down to differing narratives as to what's taken place, and a lot of that is resolved perhaps by collecting evidence. And there are just so many issues with being able to do that at all, and if so, safely and securely. Is that an issue which you've come across a lot in your own work, Antonia?
Yes, So for the many cases that you saw in the documentary, and I've also mentioned, of course, we're going to court with evidence, and where is the evidence coming from? We take it from witness statements from the individuals, also from defectors from the military as well. We've taken statements from them. So it's an absolutely crucial part, and also working with UN mechanisms, fact-finding missions, commissions of inquiry, and the different mechanisms that you have on, for example, Syria and Myanmar. And because when we're filing cases, the UN can support the filing of those cases. Just literally 1 week ago, I was in Sinai prison. I'm sure you all saw it on the TV in Damascus. It's about an hour outside of Damascus. And you saw on the TV where the HTS freed the detainees from that prison. And what was remarkable was to go to the prison, and you're seeing that evidence from that prison has already been removed of the torture that took place for the thousands of former detainees. So we have both the evidence in terms of individual witness statements, but also that there is the physical evidence element as well. And we represent more than 200 Syrian former detainees who were subjected to torture across different detention facilities in Syria. And I have to say, it is quite a moment to be in a prison and to listen to the former detainees who talk to you about the moment it was like for them when the HTS arrived and opened their prison doors, and they'd had life imprisonment, and they describe it to you, and they take you to the cells, and suddenly, just like that, overnight, it has changed for them, and who knows what the future will bring, but this is a huge moment for all of them. But yes, part of the problem that we also have, of course, is access to the areas in which the crimes took place.
Fantastic. So keep fighting is the key message. It's really fantastic. Thank you very much for your energy, for your expertise. It was really lovely meeting you today, and I hope everybody really enjoyed this Q&A and this session. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming, including those online, with some good questions too. And thanks, everybody. And I guess that's it. Thanks to some people that organised.
Thank you very much. Thank you.